Welcome to the DEC4 podcast. You can access episodes, companion articles, research notes and links, as well as information about our contributors and supporters at dec4podcast.com. Hope you enjoy the program. Hello and thank you for listening. Our leading contributor Gary Wells is with us, and it's an enormous privilege to welcome our guest this episode, award-winning filmmaker and author David Leaf, to discuss his latest book, SMiLE, The Rise, Fall and Resurrection of Brian Wilson. This celebratory work takes us to the very heart of SMiLE, Brian Wilson's lost musical masterpiece. Its traumatic unravelling in 1967 and the road to a triumphant rebirth in 2004 as an ecstatically received live concert experience and studio album. It's a dramatic and inspirational story in artistic and human terms, and we're so lucky to learn about it from someone critical to bringing SMiLE back to life, and to whom Brian Wilson himself said, "I can't do this unless you're there with me every day." David Leaf, we're thrilled beyond words to welcome you to our podcast. A very warm welcome, and thank you so much for being our guest.
I'm thrilled to be with you. We are, sitting here in Southern California, complaining that it's in the 60s, and poor Gary has been freezing all winter.
Yes, I have been and still am. Yep.
And, I'm an ice hockey fan, so if that helps.
It does help. It takes a bit of the sting out when you have something to look forward to in the winter, but it's at this point in the year, we're over it.
Not going to win the Stanley Cup this year, huh?
No. All right. So to begin with, we wanted to address the point that Brian cites you, David, and Melinda, his wife, for convincing him that it was the right time for SMiLE to be completed in about 2003. Was Brian at peace with SMiLE unfinished? Had he accepted that? I mean, the stakes were certainly high, and George and I both were wondering what, the process could do to Brian. And was there ever any consideration that it might fail? And it was interesting that it was decided that this was the time, and we were just wondering why and, some of the ramifications of the journey.
Sure. Well, one could write a book about all the questions you've just asked.
One could.
So let me try to encapsulate some of the things, because I was quite stunned when Brian said, well, it was Melinda and you, because I had not in any way, shape, or form been bugging him to finish SMiLE. What I had been talking to him about was how important the SMiLE music was. So in 1993, when I was one of the producers of the Good Vibrations box set, the 30 Years of the Beach Boys' Best, I sat down with him after we'd done a track listing, and I said, okay, Brian, what do you think of this track listing? And there was one song he wanted taken off, and considering that he was the composer, arranger, and producer of that song, okay, you don't want that? Fine. And then I, kind of got up my nerve and said, Brian, there's something missing on this box set. Between the single Good Vibrations and the single Heroes and Villains, you spent months and months and months working on the SMiLE music, but it's not represented in any way, shape, or form in this chronological box. So I think we should have some of the SMiLE music. That's, my opinion, Brian. And he said, okay, what songs do you think should be on there? He said, okay, because I wasn't telling him this is what we're going to do. I was asking him, this is your music that you created. It means an awful lot to you. We think it belongs here. And so when he asked me, okay, what songs, it wasn't very difficult to rattle off a bunch of titles, because we had heard versions and pieces through the years. And I purposely didn't mention Mrs. O'Leary's Cow because it was like, oh my God, he said yes. He hasn't said no to Wonderful or Do You Like Worms or Surf's Up or Cabin Essence or Heroes and Villains. I'm not going to push our luck. And so we ended up with, almost a half hour of continuous SMiLE era recordings with vocals on disc 2, and then a whole bunch of outtakes or session pieces on the bonus disc. And I think it's almost an hour of SMiLE music. And I didn't think there would be anything else after that. in terms of an official Beach Boys release, or there was no sense there was going to be really a Brian Wilson solo career of any magnitude at that point. And what was great was the reception the music received when the box set came out. And the box set went gold, which I think is pretty unusual for a box set. And the reviews were ecstatic. So that was thrilling. During that same mid-90s era, there were a couple of other things that happened. One was, I said to him, Brian, I really would love to get a symphony orchestra and a choir to perform this music. It's too beautiful to remain unheard. And in classic Brian Wilson style, he said, good, I deserve that. I mean, no hesitation. He knows better than anybody else alive how great it is. And I was unable to make that happen. Another thing that I did with him in regards to SMiLE, because we socialized a lot with him in the 90s. One time we were up at the house visiting, and I had brought 20 or 30 index cards with every known SMiLE title written on it. And I said, Brian, let's go in the kitchen and try to sequence this. And we laid them out on the table, and we're moving around the jigsaw puzzle pieces to no avail. We did not succeed at doing that. We came up with nothing that meant anything, because there is a certain sense that it almost doesn't matter what order these pieces are in. They're so beautiful that they could play. So that was nothing came of that. So I wasn't able to get the symphony SMiLE done. Wasn't able to come up with a coherent sequence. But I was able to, after years and years of trying to sell it, get an all-star tribute to Brian Wilson on TNT, one of the cable networks here in the States, co-financed by Radio City Entertainment. I was partnered with Chip Racklin, who for many years was the Beach Boys agent. He was Carl Wilson's agent. Big fan of the music. And by some sort of serendipity or coincidence, his best friend from high school was the head of Radio City Entertainment. And so when he spoke to him about it, he said, that sounds pretty good. And there was another guy working underneath him at Radio City named Brian Diamond, who had just produced the Johnny Cash tribute for Radio City Entertainment. So they took it to TNT, and TNT said, well, yeah, if you get enough big stars. And that is the challenge with any tribute. I worked on an Elvis tribute that was quite mediocre. I worked on an Ella Fitzgerald tribute that was quite spectacular. I worked on a Christopher Reeves tribute that was heartbreaking. So who do we get for Brian Wilson tribute? And I asked Elton John. And usually in situations like this, an artist of his magnitude would say, well, who else do you have? And Elton said, I'm there. He didn't ask. He's going to be there. So now we have Elton John. I asked Sir George Martin come and present. And I'll never forget one night, the fax machine went off in the second bedroom, which was my office in our apartment, around 4:30 in the morning. And I very sleepily got out of bed thinking, who's faxing me at this hour of the morning? And it was Sir George saying, Wild Lorries couldn't keep me away. And so now we had Elton John, and we had as good a representative of the Beatles as one could have in Sir George. And Ann and Nancy Wilson of Heart signed on early, but that wasn't enough to make TNT happy. And we were in discussions with Billy Joel and Paul Simon and a whole bunch of other people, but no one had quite committed. I remember Brian's attorney said to me, Carly Simon's a little hurt that you haven't asked her. And I said, well, Carly Simon is one of the most famous people in the whole world who has stage fright. Why would I ask her? And he said, she wants to be there. So now we had Carly Simon. And the real tipping point was when Phil Ramone came aboard as producer and music director, because now the artists knew that they were going to be in good hands.
Good hands, yeah.
So Paul Simon and Billy Joel, who had worked extensively with Phil, knew whatever it was going to be great. And then it became a process of filling in a lot of spots, which we were able to do. The most significant of those was, as I had created the show, as I was a writer and producer of it, I was insisting on there being SMiLE music. And so I said, we're not going to open the show with California Girls. We're going to open the show with Our Prayer, which people are looking at me like, what? But we got a great boys choir from Harlem, and they opened with a beautiful version of Our Prayer. So it set the stage immediately with this kind of benediction that this was not going to be a typical night of Beach Boys music. Now, sitting in the daily meetings, I was like, Surf's Up's got to be part of the show. Surf's Up's got to be part of the show. And, I was beating a dead horse, certainly, making everybody crazy. And there's a woman named Allie Gifford who was one of the talent producers, the main talent producer on the show. I said, Allie, who can we get that can sing this song? She said, I remember this to this day. She said, let me pray on that. And the next day, she came back and suggested Vince Gill. Now, I had bought Pure Prairie League albums, but I didn't know that's where Vince Gill came from. I guess I wasn't reading my back covers well enough. But at any rate, Vince Gill agreed to be part of it. And Phil Ramone brilliantly put together a trio of Vince, David Crosby, and Jimmy Webb at the piano to create a version of Surf's Up that was staggering. So we had Our Prayer, we had Surf's Up. Ann and Nancy Wilson were going to do Good Vibrations, although by everything I understand, Good Vibrations wasn't supposed to be part of SMiLE, but for our conversation and every other conversation, it's going to be part of SMiLE. So we've got SMiLE music there. And then the greatest accident of all, if we believe in, we'll call it a cosmic accident maybe, at a Christmas party at Scott Bennett's house in December of 2000, just 3 months before the tribute, Brian was sitting on the piano bench with his back to the piano next to my late wife, Eva. And it was a Christmas party. So he said to her, what do you want for Christmas? She said, for you to play Heroes and Villains. And he said, okay. And he turned around and started playing Heroes and Villains. And it was just staggering. It was just stunning. People came running in from other rooms of Scott's house to hear what was going on. Because up until that moment, if anybody in Brian's band had mentioned Heroes and Villains or SMiLE or any of the songs from SMiLE, he would say, I don't want to talk about it. It's inappropriate music. It reminds me of a really bad time in my life. When he finished playing it that night, I said to him, Brian, you really ought to do that at the tribute. And he said, okay. Well, gobsmacked would be the word that would be used if we were talking to somebody in England. And now the band's got to learn it. And until you learn a song like Heroes and Villains, you don't realize how difficult a song it is to do. But they did, and they learned it magnificently. And as Jeffrey Foskett said, when Brian opened his set at the tribute with Heroes and Villains, and because it was recorded in his regular voice, not his falsetto, when he starts singing, it's like you're jolted backwards. It's like, there's Brian Wilson.
Wow.
And so it was a real turning point because Brian was sitting in the wings watching boys choir. Brian was in the wings when Jimmy Webb and David Crosby and Vince Gill sang Surf's Up. Brian was in the wings listening to what Sir George Martin was saying about him. Because one of the things that I began to understand about famous people is they're always told, oh, so-and-so thinks you're the greatest, blah, blah, blah. But until they hear it from their mouth, It doesn't mean anything. So hearing what Sir George said that night, kind of took Brian aback. If I had to select one living genius of popular music, it would be Brian Wilson. So Brian is pretty pumped up. Elton John is going to be singing one of his songs. He's thrilled. And so he left that night with a different kind of confidence, and they started adding SMiLE songs to their touring set. Now, still at that point, there was no talk of doing SMiLE. In 2002, when I think it was February of 2002, Brian went to the Royal Festival Hall to do the same Pet Sounds set that he had done in America in 2000. That start to finish performance of Pet Sounds that we never thought we'd see. And after that, And it was so successful, the conversation, the whispering, if you will, began, well, how do we follow that? The Royal Festival Hall wanted to have Brian back. It was a gigantic success. England has always been the place really that got Brian better than, with the exception of maybe New York. But London was the place he loved to go the most. And so, I mean, so it was on that trip when, I was asked, do you think Brian would want to come and play for the Queen's Jubilee? And I said, I don't see why not. And I asked him and Melinda, and they said, yes, of course. So, I mean, that's the kind of feeling they had for him and he had for them. But still, no SMiLE. It was 2002, there wasn't going to be SMiLE. And then the chatter on the Brian Wilson message board and amongst the band and with Brian's music agent and Glenn Max, who ran the Royal Festival Hall, began like, what would it take to do SMiLE? And would Brian do it? And because of the size of the band that was going to be on stage, I think there are 19 players. What's it going to cost? What is it going to cost for all those people to rehearse this music? And so in a sense, the Royal Festival Hall commissioned it. Because if not for that, I don't know that even then it would have happened. And it was commissioned without any sense that it was A, going to be a success, and B, that it would become a worldwide tour, that it would become an album that would become the most successful of his solo career, that it would win him a long overdue Grammy Award. So all of these things, the analogy I overuse is it's a string of dominoes. And if you take any one of those dominoes out of that long line of dominoes, it doesn't happen. And they all lined up.
What I'm hearing then, correct me if I'm wrong, is it was a fairly long and slow process, but I think that's by design in a way. It could not have gone any other way because you're dealing with such fragility here in Brian and his connection to this music. There was never going to be any pushing or prompting him.
Well, more than that, yes, there wasn't going to be any pushing. It had to be his decision.
Sure.
When he said yes, and it was announced, we were in London for him to get the Ivor Novello Award, a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2003. And the next day there was a press conference, and he just kind of casually mentioned, yeah, next year we're going to come back and do SMiLE. And again, I know, is it double gobsmacked?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, so now it's out in the world. It's going to happen.
Yeah, it's breathing now. Yeah.
Well, and then it's almost immediately on life support because May, June, July, August, he doesn't want to talk about it. He doesn't want to think about it because as Darian puts so aptly in Beautiful Dreamer, it's like a stack of dirty dishes. And how do I do this? Finally, I mean, two things happened that were relevant to me and the project. One was Brian, one day, he and I were walking back from the movies on the 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica, and he said to me, I can't do this unless you're there with me every day. And I was like, what are you talking about? Because I'm not a musician. I'm not a singer I'm not a professional singer. I love to sing. Brian and I would sing a lot, what he called casual singing. But Brian, how can I be there? I got a documentary company. The only way I could be there is if I were making a documentary, because I had never thought of nor broached the subject of making a documentary. When I came back from London, I just said to Eve, I said, we got to get our tickets and make hotel reservations. We have to be there as his friend to cheer him on. Well, what he was saying was, I want you there every day to give me what he terms the emotional security to cheer me on, because he knows who loves him unconditionally and supports whatever decision he makes. So he knew that if he decided the next day, you know what, I'm not going to do this SMiLE thing, it wasn't going to change our friendship. We were still going to be friends.
Right.
And so fortunately for us, there's Darian Sahanaja, the genuine unsung hero of this reconstruction, who very carefully, gingerly, smartly, brilliantly approached the subject with Brian and figured out, Brian, how do we how do we perform this music in a coherent fashion? How do we sequence it so it makes sense for the audience? And they spent a couple of months doing that, and then they started rehearsing it. On the second day of rehearsal, a vocal rehearsal at Brian's house, this is a scene in Beautiful Dreamer, but it was much, much more serious than what was in the documentary. On that day, around 2:00 in the afternoon, Brian, who was not happily participating in the rehearsals, stood up and said, "I gotta go." And he left the room. And about 10 minutes later, the band takes a break. And I go downstairs. Brian's music room is upstairs. I went downstairs to where Melinda's office was, and she was in her office. And I said, "Isn't Brian down here with you?" And then she says, "I thought he was up there with you." And she looked out into the driveway, and his car was gone. And for the next 3 hours or so, we had no idea where he was.
Wow.
So the reality of performing this music had scared him to the point where he drove himself to the emergency room
Yes.
of St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica. And we went there and we left the hospital. And it was knowing that he could put a halt to it if he needed to, gave him the confidence, as he would say, the willpower. He says, "My last name is Wilson. I have willpower. If I don't want to do it, I don't have to do it." But he said, "I have to do it." And so he continued on, and slowly, it was like the Titanic's approaching the iceberg, and it's so there's an iceberg. Let's turn away from the iceberg. And he slowly turned away towards the music, and it got better and better and better to the point where he was actually enjoying rehearsing SMiLE as he heard it come alive, as he heard the band could take on this challenge. Because, one of the things the late Nick Willisco says in the book, he says, remember, when Brian recorded the music, these great A-list session musicians came in and played the tracks. And then the Beach Boys came in and sang the vocals, both done as brilliantly could be imagined. It couldn't be any better. Now Brian's band had to do both simultaneously. So it's a big challenge for them as well. And they were succeeding at it. And Brian loved hearing his music played note for note perfectly, but also heartfelt feelings, with passion, this is Brian, I've always dreamed my whole life of playing this music, kind of a vibe in the room, coming especially from Nick Probin and Darian.
So maybe to put a capper on the origin part of this story is gingerly. You use the word gingerly, and that's what I was thinking. This had to be handled definitely in a certain way, with Brian's, of course, his best interests at heart. But it seems to me that yourself, David, first of all, but there was other players that were involved around him, his band, his wife, of course, that facilitated this process for him. Otherwise, it never would have happened. So it was just serendipitous the way it happened, the people that were involved. And I guess the way you described the steps, it was inevitable that this music would be attempted. The problem was, I suppose, is that there was no music yet. It had to be really built and arranged, and I guess the compositions themselves had to be finished. So it's a fascinating step-by-step tiptoe process to get to the point. It's fascinating the way you run that down. Thank you.
Thank you. The compositions were primarily finished. There was just a little touch-up work. Van Dyke had to do some lyrical work.
Okay, yes, okay.
More than musical work. And then it was a question of sequencing this music. And, I think many, many years ago, Todd Rundgren had said they ought to put the SMiLE sessions out as a CD-ROM and let people sequence it themselves. And now with any competent person with a streaming site, they can do it themselves. But the thing that I think that's significant, because there are people who say, well, this isn't the way it should have been. This isn't the way it would have been in 1967. To that I would say, yes, this is not the way it would have been in 1967. However, Brian, when asked about it, he said, this is how I feel about the music now. So it's his music.
Sure.
So he gets to make the decision of how it feels. There were pieces that were left, on the cutting room floor, that we would have loved to have heard. Could have gone on another 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Why not? But they didn't fit in. I asked Darian, the story, if you will, of SMiLE was a bicycle rider riding from Plymouth Rock to Diamond Head in Hawaii. And I asked Darian if they had ever talked about Brian's Diamond Head from the Friends album being part of SMiLE, even though it was, a good year after he had shelved it. And he said, sort of, but not really. And no. But to sit and listen to Brian Wilson present SMiLE live was so staggering, particularly, that first, what I call world premiere week in London, when he did 6 sold out shows, and because nobody knew what to expect. And I don't think people brought enough Kleenex. There are so many of us who, or I shouldn't say there are so many of us, there are not enough of us, but there are a lot of us who kind of believe in, if you will, this teenage symphony to God, this church of Brian Wilson, who for years had hoped and prayed that it might be realized someday. And so to see it filled something in all of us that we needed as much as Brian needed for us to love it.
And you do take us on this incredible journey as you experience the lead up to Festival Hall and just the emotion at the end. And you wrote a lovely thing here about when, in this endless ovation at the end of the first night, when Brian brings Van Dyke Parks up onto the stage. And even this far removed, it's hard not to get emotional watching it. And you're right, if that didn't bring tears to your eyes, you didn't belong in the building. Now, you were there, of course. You were an integral part of it. You were obviously very focused on making the documentary. But can you give us a sense of what it was like to actually be there and be part of that moment?
I'll try. So, because we were making the documentary, and if you think of a film as having 3 acts, whether it's a narrative film or a documentary film, it's got 3 acts. So we were making a film where we did not know the ending.
Yeah.
One of the things that surprised me in putting together the book was, and I had to read it a lot of times. Every time we'd make a change here and a change there, I'd get a new PDF back from the publisher, and I'd have to make sure they made the changes correctly. And sometimes there would be new mistakes that we'd find. And so my copy editor were reading it over and over again. She was great on the job. But this thing that shocked me, because early in the book, I talk about this book as a celebration of something that happened in 2004. But as one is reading those pages leading up to the first show, I'm reading it like I'm on the edge of my seat. Like, is he or isn't he? What's going to happen?
Yes.
And that kept surprising me that there was this dramatic question mark, because I know it was there when we were waiting backstage. I know it was there, as I said to my cameraman, the DP on the film, James Mathers, I said, I want you to follow him up on stage. When he goes up, there's a staircase near where Brian would sit every night before the show, because I feel like he's going to be going up the steps like Dead Man Walking, with just terror within each step. And then I want you to follow behind him as we don't know what he's going to do, but let's be behind him so we see the audience. And I remember saying to another cameraman, you go up high, I want to see it from way up high. I think, oh, I'm a director. I didn't know that. It's like I had a whole bunch of directing credits, but it was the first time I really felt like I was directing. At any rate, the moment Brian hit the top step, I ran like an Olympic sprinter to my seat next to Eva, because I wanted to experience this moment as a fan, short for fanatic. And I did that every night for 6 nights. And honestly, it's better live than it is on as good as the CD is. as great a job as Darian did of producing Brian's vocals, those are the best vocals I think Brian has done in decades. There was something about seeing it with your own eyes that was very different. And it's why in the book, there's an entire chapter of fan reminiscences of what it was like to be at the Royal Festival Hall that night. There's another chapter of fans who saw the tour in one place or another. Anyone who wanted to be could be part of the book. Because, as I say early in the book, I've had my say about SMiLE in the updated version of God Only Knows, in my documentary, in liner notes, in tour programs. I've had plenty to say. Let's hear what everyone else has to say. And that's one of my favorite chapters in the book, because you get a sense from the British fans who were there and the American fans who came over. One guy who's there, who's just gotten a cancer diagnosis, and he says to his doctors, "I'll begin treatment when I get back from London." I mean, the kind of power that this has was staggering. And so it was such a pleasure to relive those moments through the eyes of the people who, like me, were fans, unlike me, were busy making this documentary. Did that give you a sense of it, George, what you wanted?
Yes, it did. Thank you. And there is that really wonderful sense of immediacy, both with the book and the documentary, that really does share the experience with us as much as that is possible. I'd like just to take us back now to the original SMiLE. And one of the things that Gary and I have been quite interested in is the issue of art versus commerce. And just a quote from the book here: "The Beach Boys, wanting to please Capitol, their fans, and Brian, were unsure whether SMiLE was the right career move, as if art is a career move. Looking back to the circumstances at the time, can a young married man in his 20s, family in his future, and a long professional life, one would hope and anticipate, could he really have ignored the practicalities of career management?" And I sort of thought it was interesting, George Martin's comment about the fact that artists shouldn't listen to record companies and, quote, frighten band members. But I kind of thought it's easy for him to say from that position of wealth and power and influence. So looking back, is there a way that in 1967, both the commercial and the artistic could have been satisfied? Or is that always going to be, I guess, a conflict without any kind of resolution?
This is a difficult question, because, what you just pointed out is it's easy to look back in retrospect and comment on it. It's also easy for me to be self-righteous about it in trying to understand the story. So when I wrote the original The Beach Boys and the California Myth, I was 25 years old and didn't really understand necessarily the way the world worked. I certainly didn't understand these were all basically kids who had homes and wives and children and were terrified that this music could destroy their career. That said, what George Martin was referring to was that the Beatles never took that into consideration. So on Revolver, which ends with Tomorrow Never Knows, on this single that came out in early '67, Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, maybe the greatest double-sided single in history, there's certainly nothing commercial about Strawberry Fields. Penny Lane has a up-tempo happy feel to it that you can tell, yeah, that's a Beatles record. But you think about the long fade on Strawberry Fields. It's like, what radio station is going to play this? Well, guess what? They all played it. And they played it because it was the Beatles. So now the question is, why couldn't Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys have that same courtesy, if you will? Had Brian earned that? When Van Dyke Parks talks about that era, he's very, very strong on the idea that Brian had earned the right to do this so-called experimental music.
Very fair point. Yeah, very fair point, I think.
other things that I think I talk about in the book that are disturbing. First of all, essentially Capitol Records in America sabotaged Pet Sounds. We don't need to go into the detail of that here. But Brian came back with Good Vibrations, and for months he was working on that. Why are you spending so much money on this, Brian? Why are you spending so much time in the studio on this? Why is it taking so long? And it's one of the greatest records ever made. And so Brian is now thinking, okay, I'm going to make an album the way I made Good Vibrations. Is everybody on board? Well, not quite. One thing for sure, none of us know what really happened. We weren't there. So we have to rely on the eyewitness testimony. The general sense of it that I got from Brian's friends were kind of the XYZ. Here are the reasons why Brian stopped working on SMiLE. If you were to ask Marilyn Wilson, for example, she would just say it was the drugs. Michael Vossi, Brian's friend and documentarian at that time, said drugs is the biggest red herring he's heard in the Brian Wilson story. So who do you believe? So in the chapter, I would count them, 10 or 11 or 12 reasons why Brian shelved SMiLE, saying it wasn't any one of them. It was all of them, and maybe some other reasons I don't even know, because we don't know, other than Brian was not getting the total support he needed, in David Anderley's words. It's like a bunch of people who are going to go bungee jumping. Okay, I'm ready. Who else is going to bungee jump with me? Who's going to jump off the cliff with me? Okay, you ready to go off the cliff? 1, 2, 3. And one guy goes, and everyone else is saying, hey, wait a second. Now, you can't question how great the Beach Boys sang on the SMiLE sessions, but was there the same kind of grumbling that there had been during Pet Sounds that Tony Escher reports on? Sure doesn't sound like the same old stuff to us. And that Capitol was grumbling about, this is not commercial. How do you have an album with 4 top 40 hits that you can't sell? I mean, come on, Capitol. It was that they did not want the Beach Boys to change. And the Beach Boys themselves didn't necessarily want to change, at least some of them. And they weren't necessarily wrong. We have a winning formula. We go out and sing a half hour of our hits. Can you make some more of those hits? Brian, unfortunately, and I'm sure without getting too psychologically analytical here, from his upbringing, from being abused, and we don't know, none of us were in the Wilson home, so we don't know the extent of it, but we know from his and Dennis's commentary it was pretty bad. What does that do to you when you're confronted with a decision? When you're growing up, you try to do whatever you can to avoid getting hit. When you're 24 years old, going on 25, and you're making music that's unprecedented, in Elvis Costello's words, what do you do to avoid getting hit?
It's funny, David, if I could just jump in. George and I, previous episodes, have talked about the legacy of pain in the Wilson family that the Timothy White talks about in his book. And I made a note here when talking about just what you're talking about. Brian worries what will happen if he does the wrong thing, because that's the way he seemingly was wired from childhood.
Not only that, which is a good point, but my understanding is that he could do something one day and get praised for it, and do the same thing another day and get scolded for it.
Oh, man.
So it puts you off balance.
Yeah.
And so there's this moment in Beautiful Dreamer where Brian says, I wasn't until I was 16 that I could stand up and walk like a man. What the heck does that mean? Well, it means multitudes that are in Brian's head, in his heart, in his soul, that go into his music. And I came to this very sad conclusion. Could be right, I could be wrong. But if Brian isn't abused the way he was, if he doesn't have that pain inside him? Does the music he writes have the depth it has? Did he need to write good vibrations to heal himself? Did he say love and mercy is what you need tonight when he meant love and mercy is what I need tonight? So how much of that pain is expressed in the beauty of the music, and we're the beneficiaries of it, and it doesn't cure him. He has to keep doing it over and over again, trying to tell it in different ways. I mean, you listen to side 2 of Beach Boys today, and goodness gracious, there's a guy, he's on the cusp of getting married to a 16-year-old girl, and he's getting ready to quit touring, and there's all of these people are dependent upon him for his living. When I grow up to be a man, what will I be? So the pressure on him from the moment he took the reins with the Surfer Girl album has been growing and growing and growing and growing. And as Michael Vossi says, perhaps the things he had been able to compartmentalize burst out of their boundaries, and he had to stop doing SMiLE. Now, in Beautiful Dreamer, I knew that for the movie to be successful, I needed him to tell me, why did you stop working on SMiLE? And I asked him repeatedly, one time it was very funny. He says, David, ask better questions. It was just so funny the way he said it. But finally, what's in the movie, he says, I'll tell you from my heart. And then he lists the 4 reasons. And when you unpack those 4 reasons, that tells you an awful lot about where Brian Wilson was in 1967 that caused him to put it on the shelf. His talent for making great music was never lost. Later that year, he would go in the studio and cut Can't Wait Too Long, which was as great a piece and could go on SMiLE any day of the week. He cut Time to Get Alone with Redwood, which was just spectacular production.
Mm-hmm.
So the talent never left. It seems to me that when he shelved SMiLE, which was going to be his great production masterpiece, his ambition is what he shelved along with the music.
So I like what you touch on there, that poor Brian, suffered throughout his life, but a man who was totally different than that, brimming with confidence, just simply wouldn't have written the same music that Brian did, that same longing and ache that we all hear. He would have been he would not have been Brian Wilson, I suppose. So
yeah, right. Yeah, from The Lonely Sea right on. Right. I mean, every album, The Warmth of the Sun, pick your favorites, folks.
Yeah.
There's just heartbreak everywhere.
There's always this big sigh and this, things are not quite right feeling to his music. And that's okay. It's life. We're all in this together. But that's what I think Brian brings us all together, because he has those frailties like we all have. I wanted to talk specifically about something that has troubled me ever since I first heard the completed SMiLE, is the question of how successful it would have been had it been released on time. It is adventurous and exciting as we know the album and the songs now, but I can't help but wonder how it would have been received by the public. The album has such a terrific glow on it because it's easy to conjecture that it would have revolutionized music. Easy to say because it was not only never released, but it was never even really finished. So the vision wasn't seen through to completion. It may be contrarian to say so, but I've never heard anyone really question that, whether it would have had an impact or not. It's just assumed that it would have. And when you hear and the simple story of the bicycle rider, the sort of fun, lighthearted Americana of the songs. And I something I picked up on in the documentary, David, was it seemed to me that the simplicity of the lyrics and the musical intent was intended as an antidote to some of the harder, more drug-fueled music at the time and the growing unrest in the nation. But you're a great guy for the proper perspective on this music. We assume this musical revolution would have would have taken place in the wake of SMiLE's release? Would Sgt. Pepper have been any different musically? Would it still be the album it is today? I just wonder what your take is on, is it better as a completed album in 2004? Is it better as a fully realized Brian Wilson statement? Or is it better as this glowing mystical thing that almost happened but never did? I hope you know what I'm trying to get at here.
I do. So my answer is yes.
Okay.
We can conjecture all we like about what would have happened had he finished it in 67 before Sgt. Pepper.
Yes.
What echoes in my head is what George Martin said to me, Sir George Martin. He said, Sgt. Pepper was our attempt, accent on the word attempt, to equal Pet Sounds. If SMiLE had come out February or March or April of 67, what would that have done to the Beatles? By the way, I have to go back and say, I think you referred to the lyrics as simple. There's nothing simple about them. They're jigsaw puzzles in amongst themselves.
Granted.
So it would have had an effect on the music world, meaning the Beatles and the Who and, everybody who was, particularly in England, who was waiting to hear what Brian Wilson was doing next. I love Brian's story in the book about David Crosby coming up to his house regularly to hear what Brian was working on. I mean, it's not something you think of. There's this stoner David Crosby, and there's sweet Brian Wilson, by the way, who was getting stoned. And David Crosby is coming up there because he's blown away by what he's hearing. And then one day he sees Van Dyke Parks and Van Dyke's first wife, Jerry. He says, come on, you got to get in the car. We got to go up to Brian Wilson's house. You got to hear what he's doing. So people in the music business, in the music world, would have been stunned by it. Now you come to the commercial marketplace. By 67, things had really changed, at least in America, in terms of FM radio. In England, SMiLE was already being hailed as the holy grail. People were waiting for it with endless anticipation, in large part thanks to Derek Taylor's work. Would fans have embraced it the way they did Pet Sounds? Why not? It was just like if okay, Brian just gave us his emotional autobiography. Now he's giving us music from some other planet. But what would it have done to the Beach Boys? Brian felt that for him to continue to finish it and release it as a Beach Boys album, it would have destroyed the group. Now, what is the problem here is this binary decision-making that he always has to make.
Yeah.
Isn't there another way we can do something with this music? What are the other choices? So in 2012, promoting the Beach Boys SMiLE Sessions box set, Bruce Johnson very blithely says, well, yeah, somebody at Angel Music, which was a Capitol subsidiary, should have said, yeah, we should put this Brian Wilson SMiLE stuff out as a classical album, and then we'll get back to making a Beach Boys album. Well, there was nobody in Brian's world suggesting that in 1967. And when he tried to work with another group, meaning Danny Hutton and Redwood, he was smacked down like a bad child. So the psychodrama played out the way it played out. And if we think of this in biblical terms, which I tend to in writing about this, maybe it had to play out exactly as it played out. And Brian was just Job. He had to suffer through it. If that's the right biblical character, I don't know. I know more about Brian Wilson than I do about the Bible.
It is. Job suffered, so you're right. Yeah.
Brian, one of my favorite quotes, I think he told it to Debbie, and I think it was in God Only Knows. He said something bad was happening. He says, just remember, Debbie, whatever happens, there's always something to eat.
Well, yeah, good.
So there was something very simple about him.
Yes.
Except when it came to his music. He was not a complicated person, although he was exploring the world as it was in Los Angeles. So there's a great picture of him holding a book on psycho-cybernetics. I don't think anybody else in the group was holding that book. No. I don't think anybody else was thinking of opening a health food store. What he was doing was so out there that you have Danny Hutton saying in this book But I think Derek Taylor was kind of a spy for the Beatles, telling the Beatles, hey, you better pay attention to what's going on here. This guy's doing stuff that's going to blow your mind. And so there was this friendly, competitive rivalry, but it was, in Brian's mind, it was a real rivalry. And in Paul McCartney's mind, it was a real rivalry. Paul McCartney flew over to Los Angeles in the fall of 66, and he was at Derek Taylor's house, and Derek calls Brian and says, hey, Paul's here. Why don't you come over? And Brian came over and says, do you want to hear our new record? It hadn't come out yet. And he played him Good Vibrations. I'll show you mine if you show me yours. I mean, this guys were at the top of their game. Paul, incredibly, miraculously, here we are, we're talking about him. It's almost 60 years later, and he has continued to do his best in every way, shape, or form. Brian suffered terribly for what happened. And there doesn't seem to be any way around it. When I heard the song Till I Die, I thought to myself, this is one of the saddest songs I've ever heard. This guy who gave us such pleasure, these things I'll be until I die. What the heck is going on in his world that's what's in his head? I mean, it's just tragic.
It is, yeah. So all these things, I mean, this such a small little moment in time. I love the idea of David Crosby going up the mountain to hear what the oracle's doing, as if he's going to be given this, here's where we can go. Now, are we going there? Or is anybody else going there? Not so much. But Brian is saying, I always use the expression, looking over the horizon. He's not content to just carry on and do what has served them well in the past and continue to make money and to make commercial hits. He's looking over the horizon elsewhere, and everybody, you throw the Byrds in there, and Crosby's going up to the mountain to hear what he's doing. Van Dyke's getting involved. Paul, Derek Taylor. There's this moment, and so I think I was approaching this in a sort of defensive way, from a cynical standpoint, defending the majesty of SMiLE from somebody who maybe didn't get it. So you've done well to drive it home that it was the centerpiece of this pivotal moment in time that everybody was drawn to, and I think it's easy to believe that it was going to totally change things had it come out.
Well, I don't know about that.
Well,
I don't know about totally change things, but I do know that something happened, and again, some people will just say Brian took too much acid. But in this great interview Brian did in mid-66, where he says our next album is going to be as advanced as Pet Sounds was from Summer Days, with just complete confidence, and he's raising the bar for himself in a way that's unimaginable. When one thinks about it, because Pet Sounds was already being hailed, but our next album is going to be as advanced as Pet Sounds was from Summer Days. It's a guy who's just so sure of himself, and he has a group of people around him who have kind of hopped on this bus. When I asked Annie Wilson, did people, object to Brian's ideas, and she would say, why would anyone? He had the best ideas. There's something that we're not getting because there were no iPhone cameras in the room back then. There are no forensic psychologists who can take a time machine back and tell us what's really going on in Brian's head. And Van Dyke Parks does as good a job as anybody is going to be able to do to explain this rise and fall. To when he notices, he points to the fire session as, this guy's in trouble.
Right.
Everybody thinks it's so much fun, and this guy's in trouble. Well, a few weeks after that is when Brian does Surf's Up for the Leonard Bernstein documentary. So, okay, he's in trouble, but he's able to sit there and sing Surf's Up. What's kind of amazing is that nobody just grabbed 40 minutes of this music and slapped it on an album and put it out and called it SMiLE. Because there was enough finished music to do that. You could have put instrumentals out without vocals, and just like Pet Sounds had instrumentals. You just think an album with Heroes and Villains, Surf's Up, Good Vibrations at the company's insistence, Cabin Essence, Wonderful, Wind Chimes. Well, that alone is as great an album as there's ever going to be. So what happened? Why did Brian lose confidence in what he was doing? Why did he decide for survival of the Beach Boys and maybe himself that he needed to stop working on it? And those are questions that, I only answer with 11 different answers, saying, and maybe none of them or all of them. But I mean, we just don't know. And it's unchangeable. It's, this is all unmutable now. We can woulda, coulda, shoulda ourselves to death. Derek Taylor writes a big story about Paul McCartney, at the Vegetables session, where he plays She's Leaving Home for Brian and Marilyn. Okay, did Brian hear She's Leaving Home and think to himself, oh my God, their next album is going to be so great, I can't compete with it? Who knows what's the moment where he says, I can't go forward? Because he kept booking sessions and doing sessions. I think his inability to finish the Heroes and Villains single to his satisfaction is kind of a tipping point. Because he's got, 10, 12 minutes of great Heroes and Villains pieces. And I think they did a great job for Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE in giving us a good chunk of that in a coherent way. So we have it. And unfortunately, Brian had to go through this ringer of self-doubt and self-recrimination. And, if you watch the Don Was documentary, I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, and Marilyn Wilson says, I hate to say it, but they really beat him up. Okay, she was there. There's nobody who was closer to it than she. What does that mean? They really it wasn't a singular, it was a they.
Yeah.
And then she says, you guys think this is so easy? You go do it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just so obvious. And this is what makes the story so fascinating, the conjecture that abounds. But the idea that there was just so many things. What thing was it? What 4 things? What 11 things was it? He was such a fragile personage in a way when it come to seeing a vision through to the end amidst all this attack, that the big bad machine of the business and the record company, in a way, I think a lot of us are not surprised that it didn't come out at the time, just because of the forces that were at work. And I love when we're comparing the Beatles to the Beach Boys. You had John and Paul, and they both had George. They all had Ringo, and the 4 of them had Sir George. There was 5 guys against, let's face it, 1. Brian was sitting there with all this music in his head and all this talent, and I don't want to say he had no help, and we could discuss the idea of that one article back in the day of Brian Wilson's puppets, quote unquote, but it basically was Brian driving the bus. Nobody would deny that, I don't think. So the fact that he couldn't get it done is almost unsurprising, because he was up against the odds. Maybe I'll pick your brain a little bit on the idea of the contributions of the other guys in the band. I mean, vocally, I don't believe anybody touches the Beach Boys in their prime. So their instrument is key to creating the Beach Boys music, be it Surfer Girl or be it Pet Sounds or SMiLE. What did the rest of the group, in your opinion, really bring to the table vocally, musically, in terms of their reputation, the band itself? Because we know that there was this thing that all of a sudden happened, that Brian Wilson is a genius. Brian emerges as this figure, and the Beach Boys are almost a separate entity. What would you say about the whole "are they his puppets" thing?
Well, I think, again, they're young people. They have to resent being treated that way.
What about us? Yeah.
As Marilyn again says in the Don Was documentary, Brian's getting all the publicity. Well, you'd have to be, I don't want to misquote it, but she says something like, you'd have to be stupid not to understand why he was getting all the publicity.
Sure.
But, I want to go back. You were talking about the Beatles a moment ago. The thing that I wrote, and as a writer, we don't know where sentences come from. But I wrote, if the Beatles could go from "I Want to Hold Your Hand" to "Strawberry Fields Forever" in 3 years, why can't the Beach Boys go from? And so the Beatles were able to progress.
Yes.
Without fear or favor, as they say. If they lost some fans along the way, they felt they would get some new fans with what they were doing. So they were allowed to go from "I Want to Hold Your Hand" to "Strawberry Fields Forever" in 3 years. And if they could do that, then why couldn't Brian go from "Surfing USA" to "Surf's Up" in 3 years? And the only answer I can come up with is commerce. So Capitol Records did not want the Beach Boys to change. They had a winning formula. They released Best of the Beach Boys 6 weeks after That Sounds. They released Best of the Beach Boys Volume 2 in the next year, and Best of the Beach Boys Volume 3 the third year. If somebody would do a count, I would guess there's probably 75 greatest hits albums of one kind or another have been done through the years. It's just staggering how they have milked those 30 or 40 or 50 songs, primarily pre-SMiLE songs. And so he was fighting a battle with a team that was not related to him. People who were on his side were not his family. His family weren't against him. Marilyn was with him. Carl was with him.
Yes.
Dennis was mostly not around, I think. But I think there was a general sense, and one has to ask who was really saying, Brian, we're with you no matter what. And I don't know the answer to that question. And we'll never know the answer to that question. Because as I said, Tomorrow Never Knows, as strange a Beatles track as there was, nobody said, hey, John, what are you doing here? They were an unbreakable team. The reason for it, even though they weren't blood relatives, they had spent 5 years in the trenches, John, Paul, and George, woodshedding and working together through some pretty terrible circumstances and conditions. So when they finally made it, it was us against the world. The Beach Boys essentially won the lottery. They make a record in September of 61. It's on the charts before the year's over. They're playing a concert, and they're signed to Capitol the next year. There was no 5 years of them playing around clubs in Southern California or anything like that. So the Beach Boys is an accident that survives its birth because the tall guy with the big head of hair is brilliant at spinning out melodies, catchy tunes. And he learns very quickly how to arrange and produce records. And they're pouring out of him to the extent that, hey, Jan and Dean, well, you can't have Surf in USA, you can have Surf City. There's no end to it. And he writes and records a song called Guess I'm Dumb in 1965, which would have fit perfectly on Summer Days or Beach Boys Today, whichever album it was finished for. No, Beach Boys can't sing We're Dumb. I mean, it was just dumb. And one of the big differences between the two groups is that while nobody was college educated, the Beatles were very smart and extremely curious and explored all aspects of art and culture and everything that was happening around them. And that was not the case with the Beach Boys. They were touring. And Brian was trying to expand his mind. So if you want to blame drugs, he talks very clearly about the first 2 LSD trips, as if that's all there are going to be. And then at some point, he starts taking a lot of LSD. Now, was that self-medicating? Was him just trying to escape the pain of what he was going through? Who knows? These are unanswerable questions.
There's a great interview that Brian did with Bob Harris. Brian said, I was able to get hold of these drugs and they messed me up. They messed my mind up. Of LSD, he said, it just totally tore my head off. And I wonder, just with some of the people that were around Brian at the time of the original SMiLE, in some of the interviews and the commentary, is there an element of denial about just the devastating long-term effect that the drug use had on him?
It's quite possible. I have a series of quotes of Brian talking about LSD in the book. And sometimes he talks about how great it was, and sometimes he talks about how it shattered his mind.
Well, I think at Beautiful Dreamer, he said that initially, at least, it did enhance his creativity.
And so, and then I wrote with Brian, it can all be true. I know nothing about LSD. I never took it. But one of the things that I heard was it's supposed to make you ego-less. It's supposed to destroy, supposedly supposed to destroy your ego, which makes one wonder if the title "Hang On to Your Ego" was inspired by what Brian was feeling at the time when that song was composed. Brian did a lot of drugs. There's no getting around that. Danny Hutton says he was taking a lot of speed because he just wanted to keep working. In later years, as Brian says, 9 years in prison with the defrocked psychologist, he was given tons of psychotropic drugs, which do a lot of damage to you. When he and Dennis were hanging out circa 81 into 82, apparently there was a mountain of cocaine. Brian was not a person of limits when it came to his music, his eating, or his, I guess, his drug intake. And so it's hard to know how much drugs he took and how damaging they were. We can agree that they weren't necessarily good for him. How bad were they? Well, Brian says it shattered my mind into who knows how many pieces. That's what he's saying. When we were on the Charlie Rose show and was asked if there's anything he regretted, he said he regretted taking LSD. How do we reconcile that with the fact that right after that first trip, he goes to the piano and writes California Girls? So we don't. And look, artists, great artists, as we know, suffer for their art. Clearly, he wishes he hadn't taken the quantity of LSD he did. And that's the thing. If one reads Beatle biographies that are accurate, apparently John Lennon took a lot of acid. I wasn't there. I don't know. But John seemed to become less ambitious as the Beatle years, rolled on into the 67, 68, 69. So maybe that's the reason for it. Again, who knows? Lauren Darrow, who's this peculiar, larger-than-life figure in Beautiful Dreamer, who doesn't know how to tell the story without bursting into hysterics, did not want to get stoned with Brian, didn't want to smoke pot with Brian, but Brian said, well, I'm going to smoke with so-and-so. And Lauren was like, well, I better smoke with you, Brian. I'll be able to handle it. And when Brian told him he wanted to take LSD, and when Lauren was like, no, and Brian said, here, so-and-so is going to, do it. And Lauren was like, well, then I better do it because I'll know how to do it right. Well, that may be true of the first time. May have been true of the second time. But it seems there's a quote from Derek Taylor where he says something like, it seems Brian was taking more acid than we realized at the time. And so maybe as we get into late fall, early winter of 66, 67, Brian, now confronted by a not unanimous, hey, this is wonderful, Brian, how do we finish this? Maybe he starts to retreat into drugs. And that's when his mind gets shattered. Now, saying that, again, when one listens to Can't Wait Too Long or Time to Get Alone or the batch of songs he wrote for Wild Honey or Friends or 2020, the talent was always there. So what was shattered is the question. And as I say, I think his ambition is what was shattered.
Right. One thing I would like to ask your perspective on, David, is a few years ago, there was an interview with Jonathan Taplin that has always stuck in my mind, and he was talking about Levon Helm and how Levon Helm was earning reliably $100,000 a year in music royalties. And with the advent of streaming, this income virtually dried up overnight. And he was becoming ill at this point and left him in very difficult circumstances. Can you perhaps give your perspective on, and I guess it's a career management issue, perhaps artists of Brian's generation or Brian himself, how this seismic shift affected plans such as they are?
I'm laughing because the Beach Boys never had plans.
Right.
With the exception of James William Guercio, there was never Peter Asher or David Geffen or Clive Davis. There was nobody guiding their career. So that you had Brian Wilson making the next record, and Capitol would put him out as fast as he could make them.
Yeah.
And with no sense of, well, maybe we're flooding the marketplace or anything like that. Give us another one, give us another one, give us another one. So that to the point where they have to do Beach Boys Party to satisfy Capitol's demand. Capitol has to put out Best of the Beach Boys to satisfy sales quota. So you've got a rudderless ship where Brian's the musical captain and Mike is the touring captain.
Mm.
But in terms of long-term career direction, there's none.
Right.
Ironically, Jack Riley did them a big favor when he came into the picture by telling them, "Okay, guys, you got to write about what's going on now. You got to do longer shows, etc." And in that very brief period between the release of the Surf's Up album and Holland, they were suddenly becoming underground and hip and building a new audience and rebuilding an audience. It wasn't until Endless Summer came out in 74 that all of a sudden the old hits were new hits again. And the battle that Carl and Mike would have on the road as to the balance of how many old ones are we going to do versus how many new ones. And that's, in a sense, they were the first classic rock oldies band, if you will.
The first legacy act, I always call them. Yeah.
Yes, it's a good way to put it. So now we're looking at it's 51 years of them touring where the set probably has the same 20 songs and then some other songs. And that's what audiences want to hear. So you can't fault them for that. However, because of the lack of real career direction in the 60s, they're nowhere to be found for years. So even when they put out a great album like Sunflower, the record company does all it can do, but they're the Beach Boys, and FM DJs are not going to play the Beach Boys. It's not hip. It's not cool. It doesn't matter how good it is. And so they're kind of the victims of their own 60s success that they don't escape until it happens again for them in the 70s, and then they retreat into the shelter of that, never to emerge. From a Beach Boy fan point of view, that's kind of the tragedy that I lived through watching that all happen, because I was there going to see them when Surf's Up came out and when Holland came out. And they're spectacular shows. I mean, Carl would do Surf's Up, so they were really great for a while. I mean, you listen to the Beach Boys concert album from that era, and you get a sense of it. After that, it becomes more and more oldies, and then I reached the point where, okay, I don't need to go see this anymore. And then you're listening to one album after another that's just disappointing. You keep expecting something, that's just not going to happen. And you make allowances, and you say, well, there's this one good song on the album, and that's a great one, and
Yeah.
but there's no cohesion to it. Dennis Wilson is the one who comes as close to a great Beach Boys album with his first solo album. And I often wonder, what if instead of that being a solo album, if that had been the next Beach Boys album? And that wasn't going to happen. Dennis wasn't going to get an album's worth of copyrights. George, I didn't answer your question.
No, but it was fascinating anyway.
So you asked about...
Yeah.
That was good. That was great.
So there was this thing called oldies radio in America. And if you had a bunch of hit records, say you were Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil or whomever, you were regularly on an annual basis from ASCAP or BMI for radio airplay getting a good six-figure check.
Wow.
As was Brian. And by the time that stopped, Brian was already a wealthy man. Not wealthy in Dylan, Springsteen, or Paul Simon terms, or Taylor Swift terms, but comfortable. And sadly, his solo career, as good as I think it's been, and I think his solo career is worthy of him being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. I think his career as a producer is worthy of him being inducted as a producer, that'll be someone else's battle to fight. Someone else is going to have to write those petitions and get to work on that. But in a sense, none of that matters to him. He would go to the piano, and as he said in 65, he would play Fields until a song came out. And one day a song like Love and Mercy came out. One day a song like Melt Away came out. And another day a song like There's So Many came out. And Maybe Let Your Hair Grow Long and Let It Shine. And his first solo album in 88 was a terrific record. Lenny Waronker, the president of Warner Brothers Records, says to Brian and Andy Paley, who was working with Brian on the record, would you give me something like SMiLE? And Brian doesn't say no. Instead, they go and they do Rio Grande, which was staggering.
Wow.
Here it is. He's done a whole bunch of pieces, and they've stitched it together, and it works. So we're all living in this SMiLE dream bubble for decades. And part of the dream was that if he ever finished SMiLE, whatever that meant, we felt that would relieve him of this terrible albatross he'd been carrying, and that he would go on to make more great music. And the older he got, the less likely it became. But lo and behold, Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE is followed by That Lucky Old Son and the Gershwin album, two terrific records. And so none of us were wrong to believe in the dream of SMiLE, or to believe in Brian, love him unconditionally. It just took a lot of us to kind of a critical mass to get to the point where Brian Wilson Presents SMiLE became a reality.
I know how I felt when I heard of the passing of Melinda Wilson. My heart really went out to Brian. You know, you run across a lot of people on social media when an older actress or actor dies. They talk about devastation, and a lot of it is such hyperbole. But I think I really felt it with Brian because of my life spent with him. I've always thought he was quite different, quite unique in terms of, well, many things. You know, when you love a musical artist or an actor, you usually have to contend with the darker side of that person. Presley and pharmaceuticals, Sinatra and his capacity for malice. I mean, even some of the polarizing aspects of a John Lennon. But I've always felt that Brian, and it's partly down to his lifelong mental struggles, I suppose, is basically innocent. Dare I say that he's without fault, or, without the faults of some other artists. His music has always been innocent, and he has also always seemed that way as a person. So I have felt that he deserves every break, and yet he had Murray Wilson for a father, and he had to battle with Capitol Records, and also to some extent with Mike Love. His vision, his hopes and dreams for his music were derailed. He suffered so mentally, and even when he regained his health, it was at the cost of his freedom at the hands of his therapist. He loses his beloved brother Dennis tragically. He watches his brother Carl die. Probably the reunion with the Beach Boys didn't work out as he had hoped for, but he still earned a sort of a victory lap. And then his wife, his strongest advocate, dies, and he gets dementia. And I'm thinking, people rally to his side and support him because of this. And it's because of he's such this fragile guy that they all want to help and support and love. Despite the joy he gave, the story up to this point definitely has a certain sadness. And for fans, it is difficult. So you've had unprecedented access to Brian for many years. More than that, you've been his friend. What I wanted to ask is, how do you process where he has come to? Like, how do you feel about where Brian is today?
Wow. Brian is an extraordinarily strong person. And now he's in a place where his life is narrowing, so to speak. That said, at his birthday party last year, they built a stage, and his band was on the stage, and the Lemon Twigs were there and playing with him, and Carney Wilson was there, and he was calling out songs and having a great time. He's going to be 83 in June. Not the same 83 as Paul McCartney, certainly.
No.
And so it's sad. One would have wanted him to have a better 80s. But in terms of, if you saw him on the 2022 tour, you knew something was wrong. If you saw him in private prior to that, you were wondering, what's up? So dementia is a strange thing, and I'm not going to get into diagnoses or anything like that. All I know is when I go over to his house, he says, "Hi, David," and I sit down and we listen to music. And I'm still his friend sitting next to him, but instead of in a car going to a steakhouse, we're sitting in his house playing music. So that aspect of it, as I say, is narrower. We're not cruising. In regard to Melinda, what Melinda brought to him was very simple. She and my late wife Eva and I led the charge to get rid of this thing called brains and genius. Melinda brought a stability to him that he characterized as emotional security. And when he said that during an interview in 1995, I was standing, to the side while the interview was taking place. And it just reminds me of how much he can say in so few words. This guy contains multitudes, and he lets it out in 4-word bursts. It's, what does it mean? I have emotional security, Brian. Why are you coming out? Why you got a new album with Van Dyke Parks and you did this Don Was documentary? What's going on? I have emotional security. Well, that means if I don't have emotional security, I'm not going to do anything. I didn't have emotional security for years. I was trapped with this, whatever. Now I have emotional security, so I'll be around. Was he cured? No. But was he treated with kindness? Yes. And that was what Melinda brought to his life. And so, I talk about intended and unintended consequences in the book. And when Melinda told me that they were going to go on tour to promote the Imagination album in 99, they were just going to try a 4-date tour. I remember thinking to myself, that is the worst idea I've ever heard. I'm glad it's not mine. And, about 2 weeks before the first show, I get a call from Brian. He's in Chicago in the winter, and he says, I need you guys to come out here, meaning me and Eva. He says, I need you guys here. He needed people there who were on his side, who were not making money off of him. He just needed friends. I mean, I referred to the song Friends, the title song from that album, as a lyrical plea. Let's be friends. And he and Mike were great friends and remained great friends. He just reached a point where working with him was not what he wanted to do. And then working was not what he wanted to do. And when he sees Mike, like at the end of the Disney Plus documentary that just came out not long ago, he's talking about stories from the 50s. So Brian, from everybody I know who knew him then, has experienced him at any point, talks about him being the sweetest, kindest, nicest person. And, he just never would say a nasty word to anybody about anything. And so you've got this giant, brilliant, strong, tall marshmallow making this beautiful music, and people are lighting matches around him. And he survived it all. If you had said in 1980 80, who's going to be the first Beach Boy to pass away, you would have said Brian.
Yeah.
And here we are in 40-something years later, and he's the last one standing. He's an extraordinarily strong person. He's an extraordinarily deep person. He just wants to be a regular person. He wants to have dinner. He wants to listen to music. He wants to watch a ball game. And, oh, by the way, along the way, I'm going to make some of the most beautiful music that's ever been made. And he's going to have fun doing it. You listen to the session tapes, you hear a guy who knows exactly what he wants and how close this, a take might come to it. Oh, we almost got it. One more, guys, let's go, from the top. But he's not a jerk about it. He's not a taskmaster about it. He's just the leader leading his willing troops into this beautiful melodic battle. And along the way, things went terribly awry.
So that's exactly what I kind of meant, is that he is this unique figure in that he is just a gentle, nice, and kind person who just happens to be endowed with such remarkable musical prowess, and it just wasn't supported perhaps when it should have been most. Just the fact that he is the one still standing. You've answered my question well. That's it. He is. I don't even really know what to say. He's quite a guy, and it's just remarkable that he is still here with us.
It is, and you talk about him being a regular guy. Tom Nolan, whose essay leads off the anthology in the book, because I wanted a lot of voices in this book. So there's the chapter from the fans who are Royal Festival Hall, the chapter from fans who saw SMiLE on tour, and then a dozen essays from people who had a lot to say in one way or another. And Tom Nolan, who was there in '66 interviewing Brian about SMiLE, tells a story in the essay about, one night Brian puts a kind of a loudspeaker on the hood of his car, and he knows his parents are upstairs in the bedroom, and okay, this is the police. We know what you're doing in there. I mean, he had a sense of humor. SMiLE was designed, you were supposed to laugh.
Joy.
Real joy. And so that it ended, or it seemed to end so tragically, was the antithesis of the origin. And the fact that there's a happy ending to the SMiLE story. People can talk about what would have been different, what could have been different, what should have been different. None of that matters anymore. What matters is this guy was able to pull himself together with enormous strength and look at this challenge and say, how am I going to do this? How am I going to perform 46 minutes of SMiLE music in front of an audience? How is that possible? I'm a guy who stopped touring in 1965 and just started touring a couple of years ago, and I'm still not quite comfortable with it. How am I going to go out and do SMiLE? And I got to tell you, it changed him tremendously. He became a different person from the first night of performing SMiLE. He became a much happier person. And when he came back from the tour, we had come back from London after the end of the Royal Festival Hall shows to get to work on the documentary. And he called me the day he got back, and he says, David, you have to come over tomorrow to do an interview. Now, when in his career had he wanted to do an interview? And when in his career, prior to Royal Festival Hall, had the subject of SMiLE not come up? You asked me earlier, was this weighing on him all these decades? Well, whether it was weighing on him or not, he couldn't avoid it because everybody would be asking him about it. What about SMiLE? And now he had the answer. He had the proof. He had several thousand people standing on their feet for as long as he would let them. He kept stopping them from applauding. And now he's come back from the tour, and I go over to do this interview. And he says, believe it or not, for the first time in my career, I can't wait to get back out on the road again.
Wow.
And I said, Brian, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate Pet Sounds and SMiLE? He says, I give SMiLE, he says, That Sounds a 4 and SMiLE a 10. Now, the album that for decades has been near or number one in every critic's poll of the greatest album of all time, he's saying it's a 4 and SMiLE is a 10. Now, in later interviews, he changed it to a 7 and a 10. But still, there was no doubt in his mind
that it was exponentially better.
Exactly. And so the joy he had taking that around the world and thinking about the next album was unlike any experience he had had. And so he became a joyful person, much more so than he had been at any other time.
So we were all rewarded by him finishing this record, but we were not as rewarded as much as Brian was himself. Is that accurate?
Well, I don't know how to measure it. The reward for him was more meaningful. It was gigantic. And so the notion of then going to Royal Festival, the Royal Festival a few years later, to perform that Lucky Old Son, and an entire 45 minutes of new songs in front of an audience. How much confidence do you have to have as an artist to do that? I mean, the only time I can think of it was Elton John at Wembley when he introduced Captain Fantastic start to finish, but he was at the absolute top of the charts at that point. He was the headliner at Wembley, for goodness sake. It was brave to do it, but I wish I could have been there to see it. But no one like Brian has done that. I mean, as much as I love McCartney and his solo work, he's never gone out and done an entire solo album start to finish. The Who did Tommy? That was a big deal, a really big deal. But and then later on, Pink Floyd and other people. But when Brian was doing SMiLE on the road, Pet Sounds on the road, nobody was doing entire albums. And so, in a sense, he became a groundbreaking touring artist.
And it's such a testament to what he creates. Is it a collection of hits? We know that that's not Brian. He was beyond that. So this whole document is worthy of being performed from start to finish live. That's the magnitude of his work, I think.
Well, it was the only way to do it. The challenge for him was, as Darian says, he had become accustomed to playing a 2 or 2.5 minute song and then applause and another song and applause and another. Waiting for the end of the first movement, the first night at Royal Festival Hall, they were all on pins and needles. What was the audience going to do? And of course, the audience exploded. These were all people like me who had been waiting decades, in some cases their entire lives, to hear this music live. The thing about it that's hard to understand is that it actually exceeded our expectations. And I had seen it quite a few times in the rehearsal hall, but seeing it live with an audience of true believers was unlike anything I had experienced before or since.
Wow, I can imagine.
Well, I don't think we can add anything to do justice to that now, David. SMiLE, The Rise, Fall and Resurrection of Brian Wilson is the book. It's being released this month, April 2025. It's fantastic. It really does just take us. I mean, you invite us into this world and share all these incredible things with us. And it's such a wonderful companion to Beautiful Dreamer as well.
One of my favorite quotes about the book came from Nelson Bragg, Brian's band. And I don't know if you have this in Down Under, but we have this thing called Cliff Notes in the United States, where if you were assigned a book to read in high school, rather than read the book, you would go by this short thing called Cliff Notes, and it would give you all the information you need to know. And he said when he read the book, he said it made him realize that Beautiful Dreamer was just the Cliff Notes version of the story.
Yep.
And the other thing he said, which I love, he says, this answers all the questions you have about SMiLE and questions you didn't even know to ask.
Yes.
And
yes, very true.
It's almost completely true. There are still thousands of unknowns about this. There just are. And this is my version of it from the people I spoke to. Given the age of everybody, given how many people have passed away, it's going to be tough to do anything like this again. I hope somebody tries while I'm around and finds a whole bunch of hidden tapes that none of us know about. But But I was happy with Mojo. Mojo said headlined the review, "The Last Laugh," which I thought was a great way to put it. So I'll retire with that review.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. And David, we love the book. Thank you for the opportunity to read it.
Thank you.
And as well as expressing our appreciation for you being so generous with your time and coming on our podcast, which we appreciate more than we can put into words. It's just such a wonderful experience for us to get, so close to a world and people that we have loved for years and tried to learn so much about. So not only thank you for coming on our podcast, but thank you for all your wonderful work over the years. And you've shared these experiences with us, and our lives have been enriched because of that. And we just say thank you.
Well, thank you, George. That's really moving. Thank you.
And I got to say, for me, I feel this proximity with Brian right now, talking to you, David, and the heartfelt, I don't know how to describe it, my feelings for Brian, and to have you confirm that he is, like I've always thought he is, this magnificent but gentle person. I don't know. I was kind of touched by that whole thing. I mean, he's quite unique, and I just really appreciate you talking with us about him. It's brought him home to me in a different way, so I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, because I keep writing these books and making these documentaries and liner notes. It's a subject that I can only describe as my mission in life.
It's a good one. It's worthy of the effort, definitely. The story is fascinating. The story is amazing. Brian, the album, everything.
Thank you. That's the thing. It's if the music wasn't great, this would be all kind of silly, wouldn't it?
And we really hope you enjoyed our conversation with David Leaf as much as we did. Our dedicated webpage for this episode at DEC4podcast.com has additional background images and links, including to David Leaf's official website. There you'll find more about his remarkable career so far, and an extensive collection of links to recommended Brian Wilson-related media, including to watch David's Grammy-nominated documentary Beautiful Dreamer, Brian Wilson and the Story of SMiLE. We'd also recommend Brian Wilson's official site. The timeline page has an excellent decade-by-decade summary of Brian's life and career. And, of course, SMiLE, the rise, fall and resurrection of Brian Wilson, is an essential addition to any fan's library. Huge thanks once again to David Leaf, to Gary Wells, and thank you for listening. You can get in touch with us at dec4podcast.com or leave a comment or question on SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, or our social media. Follow Gary Wells at soulrideblog.com, your home for vintage leisure, and Oliver Crocker at devonfirebooks.com, and at The Bill Podcast on Patreon or your preferred platform. Check out some great travel videos and tips from Steve Collins on his YouTube channel, Steve Collins Traveller, formerly Please Tell Me Where to Go. Our original instrumental theme and mellow sounds are thanks to Detlef Wolf and hardworking Gainesville, Europe's top Tom Petty tribute band out of Germany. Find them at gainesville-band.com. We take some external guidance on the fair use of potentially copyrighted material for commentary and critique. Details at our website. The DEC4 podcast is available under Creative Commons. This has been George Fairbrother. Thank you for listening.